Grant Norbury, again from Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, and Grant is going to be talking about linking predator monitoring to biodiversity benefits. Thanks, Grant.
Thanks, Al and Marina. Kia ora koutou. What I'm going to talk about here is not necessarily just camera trapping, not necessarily just biodiversity benefits. I'm talking about residual pest abundance and some sort of measure, some sort of outcome that you're interested in. So it has generic application. And just working with Cape to City, I just want to say that what's good about the research that the project management team commissioned from Landcare Research is often of generic value. It doesn't just relate to Cape to City. This is just one example. Most of the talks you hear from Manaaki Whenua today are, they're applicable to other areas, the concepts anyway. So, and I think that's really good for the rest of the country. So I'm talking about this issue about relating residual predator abundance to some sort of outcome. That's important because it's essentially about tipping points or point decisions at which you need to say we've reached a threshold of abundance that's good for an outcome. And that's what we're on about. So let's just talk about fundamental tenets of pest control, because this is what it's about. One of them is that cost-effective pest control requires knowing the minimum control effort that achieves the desirable ecological outcome. That's what we're trying to do. If you don't know the relationship between pest density and some outcome, it risks not applying enough effort, or conversely, you're overcommitting resources. So these are the tenets that underpin this. So we, being myself, Roger Peck, Andrea Byram and John Ennis, we had a look at this issue of what we call density impact functions, or pest density impact functions. And we had a look at it. We started looking at it in theory, and then we reviewed the literature to see how it matches up. But basically, there's various pest density impact functions that can occur in nature. We had about half a dozen of them in this publication. Here's three of probably the most important ones. The first one there is what we call a proportionate function. So the x-axis is pest density. Here I've got species abundance on the y-axis, but that can be anything. It could be rates of increase of something you're interested in. It might be toxoplasmosis or whatever, and cat abundance. So I'm just saying species abundance here as an example. Proportionate means that for any amount of pest control, you're going to get an outcome. So that's cool. And that's sort of the working basis, the sort of the baseline at which we work to. This is another. The middle one is highly vulnerable. So you're not going to get any outcome until you get to around about pest density A, and then things start accelerating. Or in that unusual case of what we call resistant, is you get most of your outcome by removing the top end load of pests, and then things start recovering. And there's others as well. We reviewed the literature. We found about 34 examples of these published in the literature. Most of them were from New Zealand, some Australia, some the UK, some Canada. We found that overall, nearly 60% of density impact functions was the middle one there, highly vulnerable, particularly for New Zealand. There were some other examples there. Here's some now. This is the one that's often shown, John Ennis's work and his co-authors, where tracking rates of ship rats are on the bottom there, and the proportion of pairs of kokako that are fledging young. And unless you get down to residual ship rat trap rates of around 5%, you're not going to get much outcome in terms of that indicator anyway. But it's even more inflected for things like Theo. There's no fledgling of pairs in Fiordland in this case, unless you get tracking rates of stoats down to very, very low levels. So these are very important because it's saying it's not worth spending a cent unless you're prepared to go all the way down. However, density impact functions oversimplify reality because we know that species respond to a whole lot of other different things and not just pests. And they tend to be place and time specific. As I said, species respond to a whole lot of other things beside pests, and there can be delayed effects of pests as well. So you have to be very careful about them. So pest density, the pest targets will not always be correct. And so we want to use these things as rules of thumb or smart heuristics, as some people call them. So you've got to be careful about how you design a DIF and how you interpret them. There are more clever ways of doing this. The late Dave Chocano and his co-author John Parks published a modelling approach to this sort of question of how far do you need to go, but they're very data rich. You need lots of information to populate the models. This is a rule of thumb approach. How do you generate a DIF? You need a predator density spectrum, obviously, to create that x-axis. There's various ways you can do it. You can just look at the natural variation across a landscape in predator levels. It might be in space or it might be in time. I mean, that's okay. That's one way people do it. I've got it's okay-ish there because if you do that, then there's also variation in the abundance of the thing you're trying to measure, the outcome in time and space that aren't related to predators necessarily. We know that. So a better approach is to actually do predator reductions and then measure your outcomes accordingly. That's a good approach. You can do that in space and time, but even better if you can do predator reductions and have a non-treatment. So that's the really good way at controlling for these other effects that I'm talking about. Now, Cape to City's doing that, and so we're having a crack here in that they have a treatment area, which is basically that over to the right, and a non-treatment area over here to the left. And so what we're trying to do here is just match up the data. It's a fairly blunt instrument. It's very crude what we're doing, but we're just having a go at how should we couple data to generate these DIFs, and also what are the data gaps, and there are data gaps actually. So let's have an example here. So Al was just talking to you about his monitoring, and there are the blue dots there, his monitoring sites for lizards, invertebrates and so forth. And the squares are the camera traps that Al's also monitoring predator abundance at. But there's other ways that he's measuring predator abundance. There's tracking tunnels as well. There's a whole lot of other things. So this is just an example. Camera traps are good. They're a good way of measuring residual predator abundance without going into the details there. So there's where he's monitoring. And then what we do is we overlay what we call a circle of influence. It might be cats. So what's the density impact function of cats versus lizards, say? So there's the circle of influence based on what we know about movements of cats. So in this case, the radius of one of those circles is about the home range width of a cat. So what we're trying to do is link up the biodiversity measures, for example, in this cluster here of the blue dots, with the predator abundance data from those cameras only. And that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to sort of make it biologically sensible. You might be interested in hedgehogs, the influence of hedgehogs on invertebrates, because they're primarily invertebrate. Well, then things get a lot smaller. Hedgehogs aren't as mobile as cats. And then we can start looking at, well, we've got a lot of deficiencies in where we can pick up hedgehogs in cameras. So it's what this exercise is doing to us immediately is saying we need to get our cameras a bit better spaced, because at the moment Al's got cameras out there to detect occupancy of predators, not to necessarily measure their abundance in each little spot. It's just an overall. So if we want to get serious about DIFs, we're probably going to have to do some more strategic application of predator monitoring. It gets a bit more difficult for mobile species like birds. For example, tui might, move through this area here based on what we know about tui movements, and then you'd want to overlay a boundary, a cat oval of influence around that, and then do the same across the landscape. So it gets a bit more complicated for mobile species. So the management context of this is, as I said, we need to understand ecological tipping points or trigger levels for different native species. So DIFs can help you do that, provided they're designed and interpreted carefully. And at the very least, DIFs are a significant improvement over unguided biodiversity management. But I just want to finish on this, because some of you might be sitting there thinking, with predator-free New Zealand, what's the point of a DIF? Because we're going to get rid of them anyway. So in theory, DIFs should become less relevant or obsolete as we approach predator freedom. But we've got a long way to go yet to get there, if we're going to get there. But what does concern me is currently some of the effort with predator-free New Zealand appears to be driven largely by outputs, by the number of animals that you're killing. For example, there's a fund now for that schools can apply for to just kill some predators. That's under the assumption that any amount of predator control is good, and that's the linear density impact function, which doesn't really apply largely to New Zealand. So I think that doing that biologically might be unwise, because we're not necessarily going to get an outcome from doing those things. And hence it's socially unwise, because you're setting up expectations for these people to achieve an outcome. And then what are the ethics of killing animals for no purpose, unless you do it at scale and so forth? So we just need to be a little bit careful about that issue. And that's it. I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Grant. And very quickly, so thanks for that. Pretty much back on schedule now. Does anybody have any questions for Grant? Everybody wants one question out of you.
Yeah, just that when you bring it back to what community groups do, it looks very involved with a lot of the monitoring work you do, which is awesome because it gives us information. I'm just thinking at what we do practically back home, and I'm thinking the outcome monitoring of trying to work out a simple, easy to identify birds target species is a really good one, and really it's just developing a plan that's giving us maximum predator control and rock with that, and then see how it goes, and then follow on one from Zip's sort of their research data and what you guys rock up with, and really don't worry too much about counting predators and worry more about the outcome of working out what bird species can respond, and keep it really simple, and just get on with predator control. Is that a fair?
Yeah, it is. It's a fair. For some, it depends on what you want out of this system, I guess, what you're trying to recover. For some species, there may be overcommitment of resources in theory, unless you understand the relationship between those two. So sure, you can do the best you can, but are you overcommitting scarce resources? And everyone's dealing with scarce resources. So I guess that'd be my first comment. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and the other comment was just it's really interesting you guys dealing on privately owned land, which typically has a lot of just scattered bush. Yeah, and that's where that monitoring format, which may be using total bushes where you follow a grid format, doesn't really apply, and so you have to sort of do that where you do more like the two card scenario of blanket, to identify pests. Is that something you've been conscious of working in a privately owned area of land? How it creates a different monitoring sort of scenario than say in dense bush.
You're saying two cards as an easy to use system for predator?
Well, it is one option where you can use a blanket format, and I'm not saying it's the one to go to, but just it's a different scenario on which private land's 2/3 NZ, and it throws up different solutions, I suppose, is what's needed compared to on in Dock Estate, which is typically just straight bush.
Yeah, right. So you're sort of saying that, okay, I'm not quite sure I know what you're getting at, but true cards are a good way to monitor, for example, rodents and possums to generate your x-axis on a density impact function. Yep, you can put them across the landscape. They're a lot cheaper to use and a lot cheaper to interpret than cameras. Yep, but am I understanding your question?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and whether the cameras have good application on where there's scattered bush, is that you're saying that they do have quite good application in scattered bush?
Well, scattered bush, yeah. I mean, the predators are moving over a very large area, so you could still use cameras in scattered bush.
Yep.
The trouble with cameras, they're good. They're better than chew cards, I suspect. They detect a whole wider range of species, but they take a long time to interpret to go through all the images.
Oh, okay.
So they are fairly labour intensive afterwards. Yeah.
We've got time for one more very quick question. There's been a hand up over here.
If I could just have your brief comments on the effect of the halo effect, and so that your any amount of predator control is good. I'm just thinking about that intensive predator control in in a halo in a place, and then the halo effect out from that. And your comment, please, about DIFs in that respect.
So when you're talking about halo, you're talking about... Right. Okay. Yeah. So that the rationale for a halo in that context is often to reduce immigration of pests into an inner core. Yeah. And that's a management approach that we're trying to of how we get to lower predator numbers. Are you saying that how could you use halos to generate a diff?
Sorry, I was just. It's a bit, it's a bit alarming for a community group to see that, is any amount of predator control is good. That's a bit alarming when you look at that. You think, oh. So what I'm trying to get at is that, for a community group, is it best to intensify your efforts in an area, and then have a halo around that area, rather than a sort of a scattergun approach over the whole landscape?
Yeah, I think that's a good design, and a lot of people are doing that. Because immigration is a major problem if you're trying to protect a particular area. So halos are good in theory at reducing that immigration effect. So yes, definitely. And you'll often get maximum biodiversity response in the core of whatever trapping area or pest control area you're using. So yes, immigration's a major issue for the whole predator-free initiative for sure, yeah.